webinar, self-managed super funds through property investing within a self-managed super fund. I'd like to introduce Adam Kennedy. He's the Managing Director of Ethical Financial Advice. And Adam will go through the different information regarding how you can purchase a property through a self-managed super fund. Okay, Adam, over to you.
Thank you, Rhonda. Welcome to the first webinar in this educational series on investing in property. I will be your host for tonight's session, and the topic is property investing within SMSFs. Just a little bit of background information on me. I'm a senior financial advisor and operate my own boutique practice, Ethical Financial Advice, in Brisbane. I've got offices in Wynnum West and Logan Home in Queensland. I've got graduate diplomas in applied finance and investment with the Securities Institute, and I also hold a graduate diploma of financial planning with FINSIA. I began my career in the industry in 2001. Prior to that, I was practicing as an advisor. I was a qualified tax accountant, and I've had a range of experience with the ATO, even in GST audit. I've worked in private tax. I've obviously got extensive experience in wealth creation, investment strategies, retirement strategies for clients, and direct shares. I've also got a specialist accreditation to deal with self-managed super fund, margin lending, and business insurance advice on behalf of retail clients. So welcome. Just going on to a bit of housekeeping. This is a webinar which contains only general advice. Nothing that we'll be discussing tonight takes into account your individual objectives, financial situation, or needs. This is not a public forum in which we are providing any personal recommendations or information that's specific to your individual circumstances. You should make a consultation with either myself or another advisor who's qualified to give you advice in this area before making any final decision on acting on any information you may hear this evening. And this information, the presentation, and all data is up to date regarding regulatory requirements and laws as at 30 March 2017, and like anything is subject to change, which we'll no doubt see in the coming federal budget this year, next month. So let's move straight into what we're here for, and that is finding out what about SMSFs we need to know. So basically, they're sometimes referred to as DIY funds, do it yourself. Like any other super fund though, SMSFs do a number of common things. They invest contributions from members. They provide benefits to those members when they reach retirement, and they also provide death benefits to any beneficiaries in the event of a member passing away. However, self-managed super funds are a little bit different. One of the main differences are that SMSFs and other type of super funds have their own trustee members. So that means that all members of the fund must also be directors of the corporate trustee or individual trustees of the super fund. So this means they're legally responsible for the running of the fund and all the decisions that go along with it. And they need to make sure, in accordance with the laws, that the fund is being administered as such. Obviously, members might not always want to DIY, so they can appoint approved people like auditors, tax agents, accountants, financial advisors, real estate agents, and so forth, to help them with the complexities of decision making and running the fund. So by very definition, under the relevant legislation, an SMSF basically has to have a certain number of attributes for it to actually be called a self-managed super fund. It can have no more than 4 members. All the members must be either individual trustees or the directors of the company trustee. No members can be employees of another member unless they are related. Trustees cannot be remunerated for their role as a trustee. And if there is only one member, then the trustee must be a corporate entity. So there's some of the little attributes that set SMSFs apart from other super funds like retail funds and industry funds. So quite simply, a superannuation fund of any nature, whether it be retail, industry, or an SMSF, is a legal entity, and it holds the funds on behalf of the members. And the super fund must meet the special purpose trust definition, and is also subject to statutory rules and other obligations. So an SMSF is primarily regulated by the Australian Taxation Office these days, and it's done under the Superannuation Industry Supervisory Act of 1993. And of course, that act is amended from time to time, but that's when the act was passed. So one of the predominant rules that any member of a super fund has to remember is that the sole purpose test be met. And that's where the ultimate retirement benefits are there for the members at retirement. So there's a sole purpose of the super fund being in existence, and that is to pay a member retirement benefit, whether that be as a pension, a lump sum, or a death benefit. So of course, these super funds have gained popularity ever since they've come into being, which was way back in the early 90s. However, just looking at some more recent figures for the last 5 or 6 years, you can see from the growth, the incredible growth that this sector has had. Basically now we've got total number of funds tipping over the well over the 500,000 mark, and we've got over 1 million members that form part of those funds. So let's look at some of the benefits and drawbacks of SMSF. They offer a range of benefits. As the fund trustee, you're able to set your own investment strategy, providing it follows a certain number of rules. So this gives you increased control over your retirement funds and how they're invested and what returns you may be wishing to target. So obviously, if you believe that a certain asset class is going to perform well over the coming 12 months, you can concentrate your efforts on that asset class. So they give you investment choice and control. And it also often means that depending on what you're investing in, it may give you control over the level of underlying fees that you're paying to be in that investment. So in addition, whereas some funds can only be accessed under a certain employer arrangement, your SMSF can move with you from job to job or business to business. So they provide more flexibility for members, and they're also quite unique in terms of some of the estate planning arrangements that can be introduced in later years for members. We won't go into the complexities of those tonight, but one of the key differentiators of self-managed super funds is often into the intergenerational wealth planning for families and what can be done around taxation planning, reduction, and estate planning, and giving members and beneficiaries certainty of when and where assets are going to pass to each other. However, obviously, like anything, the SMSFs do have some drawbacks. There is a higher degree of responsibility back on the trustee, i.e. the person who's a member of the fund. As we've talked about already, some of the rules and regulations are quite complex. We'll touch on some of the rules as we go through tonight's webinar, but like anything with the tax office, if you get it wrong, willfully and negligently wrong, there's higher penalties. If there's innocent mistakes, and obviously if a fund is ever audited and the ATO can see that something's been completely accidentally done, the penalties are sometimes even waived and are much lower. For people who are wanting to do the complete DIY arrangement, obviously an SMSF may introduce a series of tasks and decisions and meetings throughout a year. Obviously, a lot of people that open up an SMSF usually find that they're engaging other professionals for a certain number of tasks, particularly the tax return and the audit. Obviously, with an SMSF, there are some extra costs that you may not be burdened with by having a industry fund or a retail fund. And those are usually just around the administration of the fund in terms of its audit and any specialised steps that may be required to be done, like putting a member into a pension phase or something where there might be a once-off cost. Whereas if you were doing that with another retail or industry fund, it's a little more, not so much seamless, but there's often no extra cost involved in producing that step. So generally, the ATO and ASIC have usually set a benchmark, a level of what is required to make a SMSF cost effective, and that figure's been fairly that average figure has been fairly stable for the last decade, really, at around $200,000. So obviously there are a lot of funds in the marketplace that have got significantly less than that, and there are also funds that have got way more than that. But as a guide and rule of thumb, the regulators has seen fit to use that as a benchmark, and to say that if you've got 200,000 or more, usually depending on what you're investing in and how much you're engaging other people, your fund will be able to sort of match or emulate the fees that you may be paying in a retail or industry fund. And of course, the big one that offsets that is the massive amount of control and transparency that one has over their own fund. Once it's set up, they know what exactly they're investing in, and of course why they're investing in it. So let's just move on to the next slide. So let's look at actually what it takes to set one of these entities up. So obviously some people, they might have a preconceived idea. They've done some reading of their own. They've been to a barbecue. They've been to a seminar. They've attended a webinar like this one, or they've gone on and spoken to their accountant or advisor, and they've made the decision to set one up. So let's take that as a given that that decision's been made. One of the first steps that needs to be done is to obtain a trust deed for the entity, because it is a special purpose trust under the superannuation legislation. So you do need a deed, and that really forms the governing rules of the fund as to what can and can't be done, in accordance also with the SIS Act that we talked about before. And then there's a decision to appoint trustees. So you need to decide who's actually going to be a member and a trustee of the fund. Often with mum and dad funds, it's simply maybe John and Jane, and then they become members, and then of course they also are the directors, or they're the individual trustees of the fund. So then you make an election under the Act, and there's a form that the ATO has to become a regulated fund, and that gets lodged with the ATO. And then as part of the process, you would obtain a tax file number and also an ABN for the fund. If you're a corporate trustee, you would also have to register an entity with ASIC, and that would have an Australian company number. That entity doesn't require a tax file number or ABN. The only thing that the corporate will do is sit above the fund as a legal corporate trustee. And then one of the final steps, once all those administrative and documents are arranged, is to actually sit down and start to look at what you're going to do with your fund. And that's where obviously other professionals can often come into play, because now that you've got this thing, you need to invest the money in accordance with your time frame for retirement, your attitude towards risk and return. So often in my industry, we do a risk profile with a client. We find out what actually they're trying to achieve over what time frame and what risks they're willing to take in exchange for a return. And then those decisions need to be resolved and documented in a written strategy, and that strategy will eventually get passed on to the fund's administrator and auditor for sign-off once every financial year. So that's the typical process that people would undertake in setting up their own fund. Just going back now to the compliance and requirements under the legislation. if you decide to set up an SMSF, as we've talked about before, you will be legally responsible for ensuring the fund complies with the rules. And obviously that is done most of the time with the assistance of professionals who know what they're doing. Non-compliance with the SMSF legislation is taken fairly seriously by the ATO, and the ATO are, over the last couple of years, stepping up their audit regime in this area. And breaches can result in fines, as we've talked about before. But basically, if you approach the treatment of your SMSF and the money sitting within it as you would your existing super fund. So for example, and you can't go too far wrong if you do that. For example, if you're under 65 and you're still working, well, most people in Australia know that they aren't able to access their money. And similarly, just because the money is sitting in a SMSF where you've got access and control over it, it doesn't mean that you can loan that money to a family member. So there are things like that which are usually obvious with a normal super fund also apply with an SMSF. And of course, often we say to clients that have set these things up, if you've ever got any doubt before you take any action, you should seek advice and guidance on whether what you're planning on doing is actually able to be done. So if after weighing up the benefits, the drawbacks and the cost to set one up, you decide that an SMSF is right for you, how do you go about establishing one? So we've talked about the main steps, and now we're looking at actually what sort of decisions, investment process we need to take once we've got the fund set up. These are the mandatory steps really that a trustee must sort of consider when they're doing their investment strategy and making decisions about what the fund can and can't do. So we won't go through each and every one of these for the interest of time, but for an example, let's look at one of them. So for example, I touched on before, the fund has its own trust deed. So you might be going to make a decision, for example, of investing in a certain asset class. Now, most funds and trust deeds are done fairly widely, so they provide flexibility across the universe of what a normal person or entity could invest in. So shares, managed funds, direct property, property trusts, cash, fixed interest, all those types of assets. But let's just, for example, say that the fund's trustee doesn't mention one of those. Well, step two would be the trustee needs to consider, well, can the actual fund invest in this thing in the first place? So we need to look at the trust law and the SIS covenants to work out what is and able to be done. And then we also need to look at, does the trust deed allow for it? And if not, well, we may need to amend it, assuming that the law does allow for the investment to happen in the first place. So that's an example of a step that a trustee may need to take. And obviously, these are the things that most professionals will know automatically, and they're dealing with them day to day. So another example might be, does the fund need to borrow for, say, a property? If the answer is yes, well then what are we looking at? We're looking at the limited recourse borrowing arrangement rules under the Act, and then we need to ensure that those things are satisfied. Just moving on to the next slide. So one of the things that a trustee has to do, that the rules changed dramatically in August 2012 under legislation, was that the ATO and the ASIC and a few other regulators decided that to make it more mandatory for two things to happen each year. And that is that a fund's trustee must meet and consider and resolve the investments of the fund for the financial year ahead, and the strategy must be documented and reviewed at least annually, or whenever there is a material change to a fund's direction taking place. And the other thing that was an important introduction at that time was that a trustee must consider what insurance arrangements or requirements are appropriate for its members, based on not only their own personal circumstances from the member putting in a request to the trustee, but also what are the requirements of the fund. And that may be from a liquidity point of view. So if the fund was to be borrowing money to purchase a direct asset, and and suddenly there was a situation where a member was disabled and could not work or passed away, the fund would obviously need to be able to pay out a member death benefit. And of course, that may or may not be consistent with what it's done on its investment strategy and timeline. So the insurance obviously provides the fund with the liquidity to pay that member death benefit when it falls due. And these are important considerations, which is why there's a few slides in tonight's presentation of why, and this was one of the reasons why the ATO introduced these rules back in 2012, because what they had seen from all the audits that had been done prior to then was there were a number of mandatory fundamental things lacking in some of the funds that they'd audited. And as a trustee, you need to ensure that your fund can pay a death benefit. So things like embedded CGT liabilities and property market performance at a given time may not align with the death of a member. And so the last thing you would want with your retirement assets is to be selling an asset when it's down in value simply to fund a death benefit to a member or a beneficiary. The other important thing to remember is with like with normal life insurance that's held outside for a person, it's not tax deductible. The one benefit that an SMSF has is that it actually will be deductible to the fund at a rate of 15%. So that does provide some relief to the fund and obviously makes holding insurance inside superannuation in general a more tax effective strategy. So just touching on some of the penalties that can apply for people who don't abide by these two main guidelines of making sure that a fund has a documented investment strategy, that it's reviewed annually, and also that insurance has not been considered. So it doesn't mean that a person must hold insurance, but it certainly must be considered. There's got to be documented reasons of a meeting taking place where the member and trustee have regard for their insurance requirements. And obviously a good rule of thumb and starting place for a lot of people when they're making the decision of whether to set up an SMSF is to look at actually what existing insurance they may have in place within their existing super funds, and then work out based on what their intentions are within the new super fund whether those insurance arrangements need to be reviewed. And an example might be that you're considering buying a direct property and you're going to take on debt to do so through the borrowing rules. That would be a prime example of an insurance requirement being needed to be reviewed because you're taking on increased risk of financial loss simply because you're holding more debt than you were before. So some of the benefits we've touched on already. It can help with cash flow. It can help clear debts in the event that a member passes away, and obviously holding the insurance inside the fund is tax deductible to the fund. So let's move on to having a look at what some of the things that SMSFs can invest in. Obviously, a lot of people have got some pretty wild ideas if they've been to a barbecue or other social event and they've heard people talk about, oh, we've got a self-managed super fund and we've done this with it, or our neighbour next door has got one and he's bought this with it. So it's important to remember that often people don't always know what they're talking about when it comes to things. Self-managed super is a prime example. Some of the things that people may have thought that they can invest in are up on the screen. What was introduced a number of years ago were some pretty strict rules around collectibles and what can and can't be invested in, and if you actually are able to invest in it, what you actually do. An example would be a fine piece of artwork. There was stories of people who, quite well-to-do people, who had purchased very valuable paintings in their self-managed super fund, but they had them hanging in their boardrooms at work, which is a big no-no because effectively you're gaining use of your superannuation retirement assets long before you've met a condition of release. So the ATO saw fit to put in some pretty stringent rules around what could be done there. And now if you do own a piece of artwork in your fund, it's got to be locked up in a vault, usually not on display. And so some of those rules, when they came in, took away a bit of the shine of holding some of these outlandish assets inside an SMSF. And obviously, there's some commercial reasons why you wouldn't buy some of those things to begin with, particularly in an SMSF. So let's have a look at what some of the more obvious, down-to-earth, sensible things that an SMSF may invest in. Obviously, shares, both domestic and international. And they can be done either directly or through managed funds or exchange-traded funds. Property, both direct and listed property in all sorts of subclasses, so residential, commercial, industrial. There's no real limitation. Obviously, cash. Fund has to have a working bank account opened to receive the member rollovers to begin with, and then would always be required to at least have a small percentage of its assets in cash from time to time, just to simply pay running costs as they fall due throughout a financial year, and also insurance for members and so forth. And then, of course, able to invest in term deposits. And at the bottom there, you can invest in collectibles. However, the rules now almost sort of make it such that unless you're a multi-millionaire, it's not probably one of the asset classes you're going to be considering anyway. So another rule there, can an SMSF buy an asset from a related party? Well, it depends on what the asset is. For example, if it's a business real property and it qualifies as such under the legislation, and there are a number of things that come into play in deciding that, we won't go into those here, but a prime example might be a commercial property. So you've got a business that's operating on a premises. Let's say it's a mechanical workshop and it's zoned as commercial and it's for business. And you've already got that asset. You already own it individually or through your company. That is an example of an asset that actually can be purchased or acquired from a related party. And there are some rules around in-house assets, ones that are required from related parties that can't form greater than 5% of the total assets of the fund, but doesn't apply if you've actually got business real property. So can an SMSF trade? Well, it can. An example would be, can trade contracts for difference. So they're a specific type of security, and it can also obviously trade shares. Usually, though, an SMSF can't trade as in the course of carrying on business in trade or commerce. So just moving on to the next slide. So let's just have a look at an example of some clients now who have made the decision to invest in property. They, as it says there, Jeff and Sally, they're in their 40s. They own their own home and they've got an investment property in their own names already. And they feel that the time's right, market-wise, to purchase another property. So they've made that decision. And unfortunately, at the moment, though, they can't come up with enough equity in their own home or their existing investment property. So they've looked at what else they can do. So they consider an SMSF and whether that may be right for the purchase of the property. So they've got existing super funds between them of about 250,000, which they've decided to roll over into a new SMSF. So they follow all the appropriate steps. They document and make the decision on what investments they're going to use. And then they review their insurances as part of the strategy, because they are going to consider taking on some debt to fund this property acquisition. So importantly, they've got a base of 250,000, which, given what property they're going to consider purchasing, just so happens that they've got enough money in the fund to sufficiently diversify it, which is important because, as we've all heard in the past, no one wants all their eggs in the one basket. Because what happens is, if one asset class underperforms grossly, particularly in 1 or 2 financial years in a row, you've eroded your return significantly. So diversifying in any entity or person is important. So these people have rolled over existing super, and they've also had a small direct share portfolio, which they've actually able to in specie transfer. That just means off market transfer those shares into the fund because they decide they don't need them in their own name. So that's going to bolster the contributions as well. And that would also count as a contribution for that financial year if a transfer of such was done. So they've got their SMSF there. They've got a bank account attached to it. And then the bank account is obviously used to pay fees, tax and insurance premiums, and it receives the contributions from members. And it also will receive any ongoing distributions, interest, dividends that are coming off those investments. And as we see down the bottom there, they've got the direct property. Now they've acquired the direct property through the use of borrowing because the fund only had 250,000 and they wanted to diversify, and because they're only in their 40s, they've decided to make use of the borrowing arrangements that are available under the legislation. So that's a slide of how a typical limited recourse borrowing arrangement, which you may have heard or read about prior to tonight, would look. And that's the flow of funds. So you've got the SMSFs trustee, and I can assure you that any bank who are lending to an SMSF these days will not entertain the loan at all without a corporate trustee in place. So for anyone considering using SMSF for direct property, pretty much mandatory to have a corporate trustee in place. And for the sake of the once-off fee of $456, I think it is, to set them up, it's pretty much a no-brainer because it also will limit legal liability for any property owner owning one of these things who are going to rent it out to people. There was a case many years ago, I think it was 2010, in New South Wales, where a mother and father had a property that they'd purchased through an SMSF, and they were individual trustees only, and there was a electrician or roof plumber who was electrocuted in the roof from the hot water system. I think it was a solar hot water system. Faulty wiring in the roof. He died. His estate sued the owners of the property, and because the mum and dad were individual trustees, they effectively were opened up to not only the attack on their self-managed super assets, but also their own personal assets. And it was a very nasty test case that went through the, I think it was the Supreme Court of New South Wales. So anyone considering property would be crazy to even want to have it in your own name, really, unless it was the only way that you could get the loan and it was the only thing that made sense for tax purposes. But often what we advise for clients, particularly clients that are self-employed on reasonably high incomes who can be sued because of what they do for a living, we recommend that trust company structures be used at all times. So the flow, effectively the property, the most important thing to remember is that the property is actually owned by the bare trust. So the property is held in trust and it's acquired with the borrowed monies, and the SMSF is the beneficiary of the trust. So there's an important legal relationship there between the trust and the super fund. The bare trust is merely the registered holder of the property until the loan is repaid. So with any structure like this, the ultimate goal is to pay off the loan. And it is important that people remember that purchasing property through an SMSF, there is no real benefit in negative gearing the asset for long periods of time. You may entertain it for the first year or the first 5 years of the loan, but the ultimate goal of purchasing the property through the SMSF is to have an unencumbered asset at the end. And another important thing to remember is that you can't utilize the equity in the first property in an SMSF to acquire your second one within the SMSF. So, the SMSF cannot be a bare trust arrangement. Loans, there are some additional once-off setup costs with these arrangements, but like anything with property, you've got stamp duty, you've got higher in and out costs when it comes to transacting. So like anything, the structure provides an overlay of protection and obviously the ability to leverage up assets and get into an asset class that you would otherwise not be able to afford with your own money or the own equity in your own home. So for a lot of people who are wanting to consider direct property, particularly if they're in their 30s or 40s, I've always maintained that an SMSF is a viable way to go, because when you're at that age, you've got other change of life events happening. You might have children still to come. You've got children to raise, educate, etc. There's going to be periods of time where you're down on one income because one parent is taking time off work to raise the children, and all those things obviously affect cash flow. So one of the benefits of actually acquiring a property, if you're that way inclined to want to own direct property and you feel you want to get into the market for an investment, but you are concerned about other things in front of you changing, an SMSF can provide some sort of level of comfort, because it means that you can do your more liquid investing outside of super and do your more illiquid investing, i.e. in direct property inside the SMSF. Now, just looking further forward at the example. So they've got total contributions available within the fund of 100,000 in blue chip shares, and that's going to leave them 150,000 to look at what they can acquire with a property. So they're going, as we've already ascertained, they're going to look at an LRBA structure. They found a property for 450,000, which they can afford through the super fund. They're going to need to borrow 350, and they'll only need to contribute 125 of the fund's assets, which will obviously leave the fund with some significant liquidity in the cash at bank. And then the rent from the property and the other income from the contributions going in from members will over time service the loan and pay the property off. So let's just move forward and see how the figures may look. So there we've got the purchase price of the property, 450,000. The stamp duty, we've just assumed that's a nice even 20. Obviously it won't exactly be that, but you will be up for investment rates of stamp duty, of course, for property that's being acquired for investment. And we've just assumed other purchase costs of 5,000, which would more than cover your legals and also potentially even a good swag of the setup fees towards the entity and the Bear Trust. So your total investment of 475, and as we've said, the trustees have made the decision to put up 125,000, and of course, often that advice may come from the mortgage broker or the bank as to what they will want to entertain giving a loan application. And then the loan of 350 is going to come from the lender, and the property cash flow example may look something like what's on the screen there. So you've got rental income. We've used 4.5% gross yield, which is fairly typical. You've got depreciation on the building, fixtures and fittings of 3,000 and at 15% rate, which is what the super fund pays tax at when it's in accumulation phase. Tax deductions, of course, for rates and insurances, tax deduction on the loan interest. And then you've got the total income tax benefits of 29,000. So you've got the expenses there, interest on the loan of 350 at 7%. We've just assumed for this example, which is a little bit higher than what you'd be paying because of the historic low interest rates. And then you've got property expenses, maintenance, agents' fees to collect rent, etc. So basically, a pretty good result for Jeff and Sally. The property is positive cash flow, and that's actually not taking into account any member contributions. So often, depending on the property that may be purchased by people within an SMSF, it may not be yielding quite the 4.5%. It might only be 3.5%. There might be a higher loan, obviously, and depending on a number of other factors, it may be the case that the bank has to take into account some contributions to make the loan application work. But that's all part and parcel of going through a lending application anyways, to make, if for the lender, the financial institution, to make sure that the parties to the loan can service the loan. In this example, though, there's no issue. The loan's well and truly being serviced, and it's a pretty good result. And as I pointed out before, we don't want to see people buying property inside an SMSF with the intention of negative gearing them, because there's simply no, I can attest, being a former tax accountant, there is no taxation logic in borrowing money, paying say a 6.5% interest rate, and writing off your expenses only to the tune of 15% when you could borrow it outside and write them off up to 46.5%, depending on what tax bracket you're in. Even if you're only earning $80,000 a year, you'd still be able to write off 34% of the costs rather than 15%. So once again, the idea of acquiring a property in a super fund is to basically acquire a quality blue chip asset, whether that be shares or property or other assets. And if you are taking out a loan, is to pay that loan off over the course of time prior to retirement. So you've got the unencumbered asset, which will fund member benefits in retirement. So just looking at some of the other borrowing rules for super funds. Just a bit of a background here on the LRBA arrangements. They were first brought in 2007, so they're not new. They've been in for a decade now. They allow the super fund to borrow under an arrangement, as we can see there, where the asset acquired is in accordance with the super investment rules. So it must be able to be done under the SIS Act of 93 and also the trustee of the fund. The asset acquired is to be held on trust for the super fund, as I said, with the super fund being the beneficiary of that bare trust. The fund must have the right to acquire legal ownership after making one or more payments against the loan. And the rights of the lender who have put up the money, so in this case for Jeff and Sally, the 350, there are limited only against the asset which is being acquired with the borrowing. So that's where they got the name, the limited recourse, because like normal loans where you borrow to buy your home or your first investment property, they're full recourse loans, which is one of the reasons why Australian real estate held up a little bit better than the American market did in 2008 and 9, because over in the States, when things turn sour, you got to basically walk into the bank and hand your keys over the counter and say, well, thanks very much for the opportunity, but it hasn't worked, so here's the keys to the house, we're leaving. So apart from these situations there on the screen, borrowing to acquire an asset inside an SMSF is prohibited. So there are some fairly strict and cut and dry black and white rules around what can and can't be done with the borrowing arrangements. And it also does limit, I'll just touch on this briefly, it also does limit what you can actually do with the property asset. So a lot of people have the idea of acquiring a property on a double block of land and then moving the property and then building another one next door. And unfortunately, a lot of those types of strategies are either not possible or they're subject to some pretty hefty fines if you go ahead with doing things where one might normally be able to do them outside in your own name or a family trust. Unfortunately, you're not always able to do them with a self-managed super fund. So it is important before you maybe set one of these entities up that you actually work out what you're maybe setting them up for, because often people get disappointed where they go off and set one up, or even worse, they don't seek the advice. They just go off and do what they feel they want to do, and then down the track, might be 6 years later, the fund gets audited by the ATO, and lo and behold, it's being wound up under the regulations and paying penalty tax of up to 46.5%. So it's not a good result if the ATO really decides to come down on you like a ton of bricks. Just some other final considerations in terms of gearing, i.e. borrowing money for any purpose, whether it be inside or outside of super, and considerations around risk mitigation. Obviously, one of the reasons that your thought processes as a trustee have to be well thought out, and considering member risk management is that, where you've got a loan in place, it's important that you need to know that the loan repayments must continue to be repaid. And how is that going to happen depending on what happens with a member? If you've all of a sudden got a member who's deceased, and it might have been a 4-member fund and one of them passes away, but their contributions were factored into the servicing of the loan, well, those member contributions are of course going to cease. So it's one of the reasons why it is important when you go into these arrangements that you sit down and have proper regard to what measures need to be in place. Obviously, that's going to mean a reduction in funds cash flow, no contributions coming in, but you've still got your loan repayments. And as we talked about before, we don't want to see things like forced asset sales, particularly where there's borrowing in place. Might be at a bad time in the market, so your returns are going to be greatly impacted. You may be bringing forward CGT gains or losses, crystallising losses, and it could also impact other entities outside the SMSF, like your business or personal assets, depending on what happens with a situation going wrong because it hasn't been properly thought about. So obviously the one solution which we discussed before is for a number of cents in the dollar, we can outsource that risk to a third-party provider, i.e. an insurance company, and the fund gets to claim a tax deduction for the privilege. So just moving towards the final couple of slides tonight, we'll probably be asking ourselves now, is an SMSF right for us? Well, if listening to me talk tonight hasn't fully answered that, which it may not have, hopefully it's given you a pretty good idea of what is suitable potentially, and it's given you a bit of a insight into this area of superannuation advice that you didn't either know existed or weren't too familiar with. But if you've still got questions, obviously Rhonda's investing in property and my business. We're here to assist you navigate that area. And if you're thinking about whether SMSF is right for you, or you're considering purchasing another property and you hadn't previously thought of SMSF, maybe that's something you want to consider before taking your next step. Just the only sort of little unashamed plug that I'll do tonight for investing in property and ethical financial advice is the main reason that Rhonda decided to put on the webinar tonight and contacted me was to sort of basically give back some free education for clients, giving a professional partnership and helping people build the control of their financial future through access to education sessions like this, and obviously access to market research, tax advice, other professionals like mortgage broking, etc. Because obviously with anything, when you're investing in things like property and shares, it is a complex area. If you don't fully understand all the implications of what you're doing and why, often it can lead to making the wrong decision. So just moving on to the final slide is really the thank you for listening this evening. And if anyone has got any questions that have come up while they've been listening, more than happy to consider having a chat in this open forum. But if you don't feel you'd like to do that, or haven't fully considered what your questions might be at this stage, perhaps make a no obligation appointment with Rhonda or myself after tonight, and that can be done by simply contacting Investing in Property's office on 1300 662 768, and I'm sure anyone who's receiving regular emails from Rhonda would have access to that phone number. But if not, feel free to email Rhonda or phone that number 1300 662 768. So once again, everyone, thank you for listening. I hope it's been informative, and hope to chat with anyone in the near future who is wanting to get some more advice on this area of advice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. Very, very informative, I must say. Now, for all the people that joined us tonight, I thank you very much, because I'm sure you found the information very, very interesting, as I did myself. Now, investing in property it's a fantastic way. There's many ways that you can invest in property, and I'm sure that if you talk to Adam, if you qualify for a self-managed super fund, he'll be able to explain more in detail to you. So once again, thank you very much, Adam, and for everybody attending tonight. Thank you.